Sunday, the 29th of April 1945, a week before the end of World War II in Europe, marked a momentous milestone. It was on this day that the 45th Infantry Division of the US 7th Army liberated Dachau, the sinister concentration camp built by the Nazi regime. The arrival of the American soldiers at Dachau was a shocking and macabre encounter. The smell of human excrement filled the air, but what struck them most was the nauseating stench of decomposing bodies. The scene was heartbreaking and caused many soldiers to weep or vomit at the horror they witnessed. In addition, they were confronted with a gruesome sight: more than 30 railway carriages full of corpses and some 30,000 survivors in a state of extreme emaciation. These prisoners looked like walking skeletons, victims of starvation and torture at the hands of their ruthless Nazi executioners. The vast majority of the survivors were gravely ill, and many of them would not survive long after liberation due to the typhus and starvation they had suffered for months. Both the shocked and enraged American soldiers and the prisoners who had endured years of humiliation and abuse yearned for revenge, and their brutal response was forthcoming. To understand how Dachau became a symbol of Nazi horror, we must go back to Adolf Hitler's rise to power on the 30th of January 1933. From then on, the National Socialists used a series of terror measures to establish a Germany-wide dictatorship. Initially, concentration camps were set up for the purpose of imprisoning and intimidating leaders of political, social, and cultural movements considered a threat to the Nazi regime. In these camps, prisoners lived in constant fear due to the brutal violence of the SS. Dachau was the first concentration camp established by the Nazis in March 1933 near Munich. From that time on, it became a model for future camps under the sinister leadership of Theodor Eicke. Eicke implemented a system of horrific punishments for prisoners who committed even the most minor offenses, turning Dachau into a school of violence for future guards of other concentration camps. Initially, Dachau had the capacity to hold 5,000 prisoners, most of whom were German communists, social democrats, trade unionists, and other political opponents of the Nazi regime. Over time, however, the camp was also filled with Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma, Sinti, homosexuals, repeat offenders, and people labeled as asocial because of their inability or refusal to find gainful employment. The liberation of Dachau by American troops marked a turning point in the struggle against the Nazi regime and its machinery of terror. It was a harrowing testimony to the atrocities committed by the Nazis and left the world with an indelible image of the horror of those concentration camps. During the first years of operation, the number of Jews interned in the Dachau concentration camp was relatively low. The Jewish prisoners who arrived there belonged to specific groups mentioned above or had transgressed the Nuremberg laws of 1935, which dealt with the racial question according to Nazi ideology. In early 1937, the SS, using prisoner labor, undertook the construction of a large complex on the grounds of the former camp, which had housed an ammunition factory in deplorable conditions. This new construction was officially completed in mid-August 1938 and remained unchanged until the end of the war in 1945. As persecution of Jews increased, the number of Jewish prisoners in Dachau rose considerably. After the tragic Kristallnacht on 10, the 11th of November 1938, when the Nazi SA, together with the German civilian population, ransacked Jewish homes, businesses, synagogues, hospitals, and schools, approximately 11,000 Jews were sent to the Dachau concentration camp. Most of these people were released after weeks or months of imprisonment, as they demonstrated their intention to emigrate from Germany. Dachau was divided into two sections, the camp area and the crematoria area. The camp area consisted of 32 barracks, including one for priests imprisoned for opposing the Nazi regime and another reserved for medical experiments. The camp administration was located at the main entrance, and there were buildings housing the kitchen, laundry, showers, and workshops. The most ominous structure, however, was the bunker, used by the SS to isolate and subdue rebellious and defiant prisoners. These prisoners suffered prolonged confinement, torture, and ultimately death. The area between the prison and the central kitchen was used to carry out systematic executions of inmates. The concentration camp was surrounded by an electrified barbed wire fence, a ditch, and a wall with 7 watchtowers, establishing a security barrier to prevent prisoners from escaping. With the outbreak of the Second World War on the 1st of September 1939, the situation worsened drastically for the prisoners in the Dachau concentration camp. Inhumane working conditions, food shortages, and lack of hygiene contributed to an alarming increase in mortality. From 1940 onwards, increasing numbers of prisoners were transported to Dachau from the countries occupied by the German armed forces. In 1942, the crematorium area was built next to the main camp, including a gas chamber. However, there is no conclusive evidence that this gas chamber was used to murder people. Instead, a selection was carried out in which those deemed too ill or too weak to work were sent to the euthanasia killing center at Hartheim, near Linz, Austria. More than 2,500 Dachau prisoners were murdered in the gas chambers at Hartheim. In addition, mass executions by firing squad were carried out. first in the bunker courtyard and then on a specially designed SS firing range. Thousands of prisoners, including at least 4,000 Soviet prisoners of war following the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, perished there. From 1942 onwards, German doctors began to conduct clinical experiments on Dachau prisoners. Doctors and scientists from the Luftwaffe and the German Experimental Aviation Institute conducted trials on hypoxia and hypothermia, as well as tests to develop methods of making seawater drinkable intended to help German pilots involved in bombing raids or shot down in freezing water. Experiments were also carried out to test the efficacy of pharmaceuticals against diseases such as malaria and tuberculosis. As a result of these experiments, hundreds of prisoners died or were permanently disabled. In addition to the experiments, Dachau prisoners were also forced to work as forced labor. They were assigned tasks in camp operations, in construction projects, and in small cottage industries set up within the camp. They did road construction work, worked in quarries and drained swamps, all under appalling conditions. During the war, the forced labor of concentration camp prisoners became increasingly crucial to German armaments production. During the summer and autumn of 1944, in an attempt to increase military production, satellite camps were established throughout southern Germany under the administration of Dachau. These centers housed around 140 subcamps where prisoners were forced to work in armaments factories, many of them to death. With the advance of the Allied forces into Germany, the Nazis began to move prisoners from the concentration camps near the front to prevent their liberation. Evacuees from the camps in the east were continually arriving in Dachau, resulting in a dramatic deteriorations in conditions for the prisoners. With over 30,000 prisoners, the camp was extremely overcrowded. The barracks, originally designed to hold 200 prisoners, were now crammed with more than 1,600. After days of travel with little food or water, the inmates arrived weak and exhausted, on the verge of death. Overcrowding, poor sanitary conditions, shortages of supplies, and general weakness triggered a typhus epidemic in Dachau, claiming the lives of between 100 and 200 prisoners a day. During the last 6 months of the war, more than a third of the 41,500 victims who perished in Dachau died from these terrible conditions. At the end of April 1945, the SS began the evacuation of Dachau to prevent its liberation by Allied troops. At least 25,000 prisoners were sent to the Tyrol on grueling foot marches known as death marches. During these marches, the Nazis shot those who could not continue, and many more died of starvation, hypothermia, or exhaustion. Several thousand prisoners lost their lives during the evacuations. Finally, on the 29th of April 1945, the main Dachau camp was liberated by units of the US 45th Infantry Division. Although the camp commander, Martin Weiss, had already fled, there were still SS guards in the camp who opened fire on the American liberators. However, they surrendered in the face of the superiority of the American army. After the surrender of the guards, the US troops were able to enter the camp facilities. However, nothing could have prepared them for the horrific scene they encountered. As they approached the camp, they found more than 30 train cars filled with decomposing corpses, which explained the unbearable smell they had smelled. Inside the camp, they discovered more lifeless bodies, often naked, scattered everywhere, sometimes piled on top of each other like logs. The sight of these atrocities changed the meaning of war for many soldiers. They realized that they were not just fighting an enemy, but evil in its purest form. The Nazis tried to incinerate as many bodies as possible before leaving Dachau, but there were too many. One soldier later recalled, "Everywhere you look, you feel absolute horror. People are so close to death or in a state of complete decrepitude that you can't even process it." While some American soldiers burst into tears, others were filled with rage, anger, and hatred. When 4 German officers emerged from the woods with a white handkerchief in their hands, an American lieutenant ushered them into a wagon full of corpses and executed them. When the mortally wounded Germans screamed in agony, another American officer put them out of their misery. The situation got even worse. After the American soldiers ordered the SS guards to line up along the courtyard wall, Lieutenant Walsh shouted, "Fuck them!" and the American soldiers opened fire with rifles, pistols, and 30 caliber machine guns. The Nazi guards were killed instantly after a 30-second burst of gunfire, but that was not the end of it. The prisoners themselves, who had been tortured and treated worse than animals for all those years, also sought revenge. They had lost family members, some had witnessed violence against their wives, and others had seen atrocities such as children being thrown into the air to be shot by members of the SS. They swore that given the chance, they would kill the SS guards, and they kept their promise. When the prisoners captured the guards, they tried to escape, but were caught again and this time killed, thus completing their revenge. Other SS men and bosses were beaten to death by prisoners with sticks, tools, or even their own fists. One American soldier witnessed a prisoner stomp on the face of an SS soldier until, he later claimed, there was nothing left. Some SS guards who had exchanged their uniforms for prisoner clothing were instantly recognized and lynched. While all this was going on, both prisoners and American soldiers often stood motionless, watching coldly and mercilessly as the revenge was carried out. One US officer later said, "We stood by and watched these guards being beaten to death." The soldiers beat the Nazis in such a way that in the end, their bodies were torn apart and their entrails exposed. We watched these scenes with less feeling than if they were beating a dog. In fact, we could say that we had completely lost our emotions. Deep anger and hatred had destroyed all our feelings. Finding a kennel full of German shepherds and Doberman pinschers, the American soldiers decided to kill these animals as well, as it was rumored that the Nazis had fed them the bodies of political prisoners. Later, US troops forced German citizens of the town of Dachau to visit the camp and witness for themselves the atrocities that had been committed there, as well as to help bury the corpses. Many of the local residents were shocked by this experience and claimed to have no knowledge of the barbarities that had been carried out over the years. To this day, it is unclear how many SS guards died, but estimates range from 30 to 50, because General Patton, then military governor of Bavaria, dismissed all charges. No one has ever been tried in court for this reprisal. Of the more than 200,000 people who were imprisoned in Dachau and its numerous satellite camps during the 12 years of its existence from 1933 to 1945, almost 42,000 people were killed. So much for the new episode of Eternity. What did you think today? Let me know what you think in the comments. I read you all. Support our work with a like and subscribe so you don't miss any content. See you inside.